So, in making fresh pasta, I'm going to take you through the process on this. Want to take your time though. Um, to be honest, I originally ripped this and set it up to 300% to see what that would read like. But one of the things that people have liked is that these instructional videos do take a little bit of time and really walk through the process. So to begin with this, I just shot down 1 cup of all-purpose flour, 1 large egg, 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt, and because this is more geared toward a beginner, I ran with 3 tablespoons of water. With that 3 tablespoons of water, it's going to make this dough a little bit softer and easier to knead. That way you don't need a food processor or a mixer to do this. You can do it as I'm doing with a fork. Notice I started just in the middle and start working that flour into the actual mixture in the middle. When creating that dish or that bowl, you can do this on any surface or even a cutting board. You want to keep mixing it until that egg, that water, that salt incorporates into the flour, and try not to let it go. Trust me, the first few times I did this, I had egg mixture running all over the place. And if you do, just run some flour on it and pick it up. So as you're going, you'll notice that the dough is starting to thicken up a little bit. And as that gets more flour into it, and as that flour starts hydrating, the dough will actually start getting thicker. Pretty soon it'll start coming into a shaggy mess. And what I can tell you is try to keep it off your hands until the very last minute to where you're actually going into kneading. Now it's starting to come together. It's almost at a point where I like to shift tools and move to an actual bench knife right there to help pull that off together. And then I can start keeping my area clean and keeping the flour together so that way it doesn't run amok all over the kitchen. As you can see, I'll just pick this up and keep folding it over. And again, this can all be done by hand, but I personally like to try to limit the amount of dough that goes into my fingernails, under my fingernails, and all over the place. So this is the way that I found to do it that works best for me. Obviously, there's many different ways to do this. And like I said in the beginning, even with a food processor, it can be done. But, sometimes it's nice just to do this by hand, and you actually start feeling what the dough and things should feel like. Because ultimately, we're going to need this. And as we need it, we're going to build that gluten content and those strands that kind of make it that stringy. So if we develop them correctly, this dough should be able to be rolled out to a very, very thin pasta. And that's what you ultimately want to go for. It cooks faster. It gives a better mouthfeel when it's al dente, tender but firm to the bite or firm to the tooth, and giving you an overall higher quality finished product. Again, just keep working the flour and keep picking it up. There'll be little bits here and there all of a sudden you'll see, and just go ahead and put the dough over it and just keep kneading. Notice I'm taking from the outside or the upper part and bringing it down to the middle and kneading it just like you would a bread dough. Again, finding those piles of flour, getting those incorporated. When you're done with this dough, it'll feel nice and smooth, and you shouldn't have any problems with your arms or your hands cramping. I know some people with arthritis and stuff that tends to aggravate it. This should be a soft enough dough to do it. The trade-off on that, though, working with a softer dough, is at the finish process when you go to roll out. When you go to roll out, you're going to need to make sure to throw plenty of flour down. And I'll point that out when we get to that part in the video. So if you see this, you can press down, again, pull from the outside and push down. At this point, that I'm pushing quite firmly on that dough, and it's giving me a lot of resistance. It's not wanting to flatten out. That tells me that the actual gluten is getting built. And I can feel it in my hands that this dough is coming together. It's still a little sticky, so I'm increasing the flour. Now, another way you can do that is decrease the initial water. But because I wanted to make an easier dough to work with, I kept the hydration higher on this, or the water content. If you look close, you can see as I'm pressing down, you can see those gluten strands kind of stretching or tearing. So at this point, I know it's done. I'm going to divide the dough out into two, because what I know with this amount of dough, this will make a good rollout. So it's something sizable that will give you a good shape or good length on your pasta, and it won't be too long. If you want to run really long pasta noodles for, say, lasagna, then by all means you could roll the whole thing out if you have a large counter space to do that. The other thing is, I need one and then shape it, flatten it, and leave it to the side and just let it sit for a few minutes, just to let that gluten relax a little. Because ultimately what I want to do is have a couple pucks of dough that can be relaxed. Now, when I do this, I'll go back and forth a few times, making sure that I take that dough, let it rest, shape the other, let it rest, and back and forth. That way it gives a little time, again, for that gluten to settle and for me to get the size shape that I want and the thickness that I want. So when I go for the final rollout, it's a little easier. Now the one is sitting there resting, the other one working, and that one, even just with that few minutes of letting it set, it was able to go pretty quick. So you just throw this in a plastic bag. Try to keep it airtight, because air is not your friend at this point, because that pasta will dry out. And at this point, we don't want that pasta dry. Certainly in a few we would. So at this point, you can let this pasta, you can put it in the refrigerator and let it sit overnight. Or you can just let it sit on the counter in that plastic bag for about a half hour to 45 minutes. Once it's rested, it should be ready for rolling out. So we're a half hour later. It's actually 45 minutes later on this roll, heavily dusted, because what will happen is you'll notice after the rest that the dough itself is a little bit tackier. It's a little sticky. Remember in the earlier portion, I said that the trade out of rolling a softer dough like this was going to be that when you get to this point, it'll be easy to roll out, but you gotta have that flour down. Now, if you pay close attention to the dough and watch it move on the actual table or on the actual counter, there'll be points where you can see the dough stop and kind of stick to the, on this, it happens to be granite. So it could be wood, it could be stainless steel, whatever you're rolling out on. If you want to keep an eye on it, because as soon as you roll and it stops and sticks, you got to dust it. If you don't, that dough, as you're starting to go thinner and thinner and thinner, will actually take and stick to the thing. You'll go to try to cut it and it'll just be a hot mess. But if you just watch on the rollout, it should roll. It'll kind of spring back because that gluten, it's still in there. And you're working it, so it's going to agitate it again. It's going to spring it back. And so I lift. The other thing I do is I flip my dough over. If you see that upper left-hand corner, you can see that little wrinkle I'm keeping an eye on right now to make sure that I don't buckle it under. So as this rolls out with a French pin that's tapered on either end, I notice that my edges tend to go a little bit thicker. And so I really have to pay attention to my edges. The middle will roll out fine. So those edges will kind of have a little bit of bump to them. So it's something I just want to focus on. Again, over and over, turning it, keeping that pasta loose. Now, as I get this pasta thinner and thinner, you can see we're starting to get into some okay size here. But you'll also start to see, if you look closely, you can start seeing the black colors in that granite coming through the actual pasta dough. Just kind of as an example, just looking, going, so even with that black handle on that knife, can't really see it that much. So we're gonna go thinner. So how thin? Again, keep an eye. There's very faint shadowing that you can see through that dough. But if you start watching that, you'll start to see it more and more, and it's getting thinner and thinner. If you've done the initial kneading correctly to the dough, you should be able to take this just hyper thin, like within the 32nd of an inch. And the reason I know that in the summer I like to take this dough, roll it out, go incredibly thin with it, like the 32nd of an inch, and then take that and divide it in half and take fresh edible flower leaves and make a confetti color of the flower leaves, sprinkle them in that half, fold it over, and roll it out to what would be considered a normal thickness of pasta. And again, relative terms, the end product dictates how thick I'm rolling, and in this case it's going to be for a fresh pasta sauce, pomodoro. So because of that, I'm going to roll this one fairly thin, right in about an 1/8 inch. Actually, it would be less than an 1/8 inch. So looking to see how I got it, you can start seeing the granite right through there and getting close to where I want to be. This is where I've really noticed that I have those ridges, and the ridges aren't high. The difference might be a 1/16 of an inch. So it's not that much, but it's noticeable. And my what I want to do is make sure that that is perfectly the same thickness all the way across, because ultimately when I take it and roll it up, I want to take and make sure that when I cut it, it's the same thickness all the way through. That's going to give the best cooking, so that way it's the same thickness. If you had it really thick on one end, really thin in the middle, and thick on the other end, your middle could be overcooked and yet your edges would be undercooked. So I'm doing here, just throwing some more flour down, dusting it, and I'm going to roll this up. And this is an area that if you go too much flour, it can muck up your water when you go and cook it. If you go not enough, it's going to stick together. So it's finding that happy medium. Because I'm doing the fettuccine, cutting 1/4 of an inch. Again, you just eyeball shot it. And you can also, there's different, it's worth taking exploration, looking on the internet, all the different shapes and things you can do. We can roll out sheet dough, making raviola is easy, making tortellinis, any kind of the rectangular shaped noodles. And so be creative. There's companies out there that even make pasta in the shape of SpongeBob. So be creative with it. So I'm just taking these, and right now, since these are going to go directly into hot boiling water, I'm not going to worry about drying them out. But I found a really cool, inexpensive chef's tool that you can use for doing this at home without having to spend more money. Because sometimes you want to dry your pasta and keep it for the next day or later on. Maybe you're making it in the morning for an evening meal. So I found that these nice, expensive pasta hangers work quite well, especially if you're only using them once in a while. Now, if you get into this and you really enjoy doing it, I do recommend getting some Dowel pasta hangers. They have actually ones made from plastic, from Dowel. Just depends on what you like and what you want to use. But definitely worth the money and worth the time. That way you can keep your pasta, keep it nice for later use. You don't have to use it immediately. So let's cook some pasta. So what I have here is I do have boiling water. I know it looks a little bit different on the screen. It is just straight up boiling water, and what I've added is some avocado oil. Now you can use olive oil, avocado oil, any kind of your oils will work. And because I'm cooking fresh pasta, and this pasta is going to be cooked immediately, so it's going to go from this pot into a saute pan, I can put the oil in there, and when I bring the pasta back through the water or through the top, it's going to enrobe or coat the outside of the pasta with that oil. Some people think that you put the oil on top of the water when cooking pasta to keep the foam down and to keep it from foaming over and making a mess. That isn't what causes that. What causes that is the ratio of pasta to water. If you're using a dry pasta, you always want to go 1 gallon per 1 pound of pasta. If you follow that rule, guaranteed you won't overboil, unless you're in a 1-gallon pot trying to put 1 gallon of water in and then adding pasta to it. Then yeah, it would overflow. But if you're using a 2 or 3 gallon pot and you're just doing a pound of pasta or 2 pounds of pasta, just keep that ratio of 1 to 1 pound of pasta to 1 gallon of water. So with this, I've also added some salt in that water. And salt does a couple things. It's going to raise the boiling temperature to 214 degrees instead of 212. I'm right at about 300 feet off sea level. And what that does is it really helps with the recovery, how fast take a room temperature pasta and put it into boiling water and have it coming back to a boil. Now I'm taking my pan, getting it hot. I'm adding some, in this case, avocado oil. You can, again, use any oil you would like. I just have a preference to it for flavor. And what I'm doing is on the side, I have a skimmer called a spider. And I'm able to take that and lift that pasta out of the water, keep it hot while that oil heats up, while the water drains off of it. It's imperative that you get that water off the pasta before adding it to that pan. If you haven't had a lot of experience with that, I would suggest being very careful, because anytime you have hot oil and water and mixing that together, you want to be careful with that open flame. Even on electric, you want to be careful, because water and hot oil certainly does not mix. So as soon as this comes up to heat, I add my pasta in there and gently move it around. So what I'm doing here is I'm just letting the heat evaporate the water. I want the water off the pasta and rub it into the oil, season it with salt, and then gently, as that water evaporates, then that pasta becomes loose and it's able to accept more flavors. So I'm adding some fresh chopped parsley and then letting that heat up. And at this point, I'm actually taking and cooking the outside of the noodle a little more. Technically, it's already cooked. I just want to make sure all of that water's dried off there. Adding a little bit of Parmesan Romano blend, giving it a toss to get it hot. And over to the side, I made a fresh tomato sauce, and we're going to assemble and plate that up next. And I have chosen just to take this pasta and build to the eye. Using a fork is a wonderful thing to plate up with pasta. You just stick it in there, make sure you don't hit your pan so you don't scratch it, and just curl it right up, and then you're able to build to the eye. And this is what the overall final product looked like. The fresh pasta, put some oil on the plate for a little more flavor to punch it up, and topped it with a little bit of basil and the Parmesan Reggiano. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope the content was clear, and enjoy cooking.